My name is Grace Whitmore, and I am 68 years old. After years of holding everything together for everyone else, I finally made a decision that was only for me. I bought a small cottage by the sea in Oregon. That first week, I walked through the front door with groceries in my arms, breathing in the smell of salt air mixed with fresh wood. For the first time in decades, the house was mine alone, and the sound of the tide outside felt like a promise. The bag slipped from my hand before I even realized what I was seeing. Eggs cracked against the tile yolk, spreading like a stain. Apples rolled across the floor toward the hallway. I stood frozen as my son Axel looked up from the living room, a tape measure stretched in his hand. Beside him, Hila pointed at the back wall, speaking quickly about how the space could be opened. On my reading chair, the one place I kept sacred, her mother sat with a travel mug in hand. A stranger with a clipboard gestured toward the ceiling as if this was a tour. The air carried the faint trace of perfume I did not know. A paper cup rested on the arm of my chair as though it belonged there. Thin tape marks crossed the hardwood floor, faint lines, showing where someone had measured without permission. I stepped inside slowly, my shoes brushing past broken eggs, my heart thudding with every small detail that told me I was no longer alone in my own home. Hella smiled too wide, telling me the cottage was perfect for what they had been thinking. Axel shrugged as if the plan was obvious. I said nothing. I simply walked to the door and opened it, holding it wide without a single raised word. One by one they filtered out, not ashamed, not even hurried as if I were the guest. Axel kissed my cheek in passing. Hella's mother gave me a look of pity. The realtor mumbled about potential. I stood until the last of them was gone and closed the door with a click that felt final. That evening, I called the locksmith. I watched the sun set across the waves through the window as I waited, the sky burning orange against the water. The man replaced every lock without asking questions. I held the new keys in my palm, the metal warm from his hand. I thought of the eggs still staining the tile, the broken shells scattered like warnings. I thought of the sea light pouring across the floor, clean and steady, reminding me that peace had to be guarded. The house was mine, but already it carried the marks of intrusion. I promised myself it would not happen again. I am Grace Whitmore, 68 now, but my story did not begin with the cottage. Long before I held those new keys, my life was already shaped by sacrifice. It started the day Michael died, and Axel was only 12. Since then, my life has been work care and a quiet promise that he would not fall if I could help it. Michael got sick in spring, and I drove him to appointments while reading numbers I did not understand. By autumn, I signed papers alone and came home to a house that echoed when I set down my keys. Axel was lanky and angry and still a child. I packed lunches, checked homework, and treated silence like a truce. At night, I faced bills and the school calendar and tried not to let fear show. The library kept me upright. I opened the doors each morning and shelved returns with a smile. After hours, I cleaned offices so the numbers could meet in the middle. Some nights, I sewed at the kitchen table while the washer thumped in the hall. I hemmed a Halloween cape with the ledger stacked near my elbow. The costume glittered under the lamp, and the math agreed to balance. Axel saw the finished costume, the hot breakfast, the clean jersey. He did not see the hours behind those things. I let the work be invisible because that felt like love. College brochures arrived in a bright stack. Axel circled campuses and talked about a life bigger than our town. I said he should go where his mind could stretch, and then went to the bank to see what I could stretch too. We visited schools, signed forms, and learned the price of ambition before the acceptance letter arrived on a windy day. I co-signed the loan with a hand that shook only after I left the counter and took extra shifts selling Michael's tools to cover a gap. Axel graduated into a city job and called with quick headlines while I made small routines that fit one person. He met Hila, and their energy was forward. When they talked about a starter home, I said I would help because that was what I had always said. I wrote a check for $30,000 and watched them smile on a porch I would visit a few times a year. Then the twins came early. I packed a suitcase and moved into the room near the laundry so I could be close to bottles and the hum of the dryer. Days became a braid of spreadsheets and burp cloths, and nights a chain of alarms I learned by heart. I logged into work at the kitchen counter and muted meetings to warm milk. Love lifted heavy things without asking for applause. 5 months later, I returned to my apartment and slept through a storm. I set my phone on the table and waited for the next request without admitting I was waiting. When Hila lost her job, Axel said the mortgage was behind and daycare had closed. I wired $20,000 before the teller finished her sentence and walked out with the receipt warming my palm. I told myself it was temporary and that young families stumble. Asks began to arrive as suggestions with timelines already attached. I stepped in before the fall and absorbed the impact so no one else would bruise. After a while, I forgot how to stand still and let people meet their own ground. I thought love meant covering the gap every time it opened. When I bought the cottage, I kept the news small to keep the joy safe. I liked the porch that faced the water and the floor that made a sound under my heels, and I tucked a spare key into a zipper pocket because old habits are hard to set down. One afternoon, I went to fetch that key and felt the drop that comes with an unwelcome fact. The pocket was open and lighter than it should have been. I knew the difference between losing something and being relieved of it. I checked the places I always check and came up empty. I replayed the last visit and remembered Axel moving my purse off a chair while Hela's mother studied the room like a map. A quiet thought settled and would not leave. Maybe I had taught them to expect that my life could bend around their plans. Maybe I had planted the lesson that my yes would always be waiting. It takes seasons of small rescues to write that story, and the belief that love means fixing what breaks before others see the crack. I thought about the cape under the lamp, the ledgers, the porch photo, the cashed check, the night feedings, and the way my name kept slipping to the last line. Love had made me strong, but it had also made me useful in a way that erased me. A lifetime of yes had shaped a son who believed I would never say no. I am not cruel when I admit this. I am honest about the pattern I helped write. Axel learned that I would fill the gap, and Hela learned that the gap would not cost them much. We all followed a script we rehearsed for years and mistook it for love. That is why the missing key felt larger than metal. It was a lesson made visible, a small theft of boundary dressed as convenience. It proved my generosity had become access instead of care. I stood at the sink and let the water run until it turned cold and thought about safety nets. They catch you when you fall, but they are not meant to be the floor you live on. I had wanted to be a safety net. Somewhere along the line, I became a spare wallet. I wiped the counter and put my purse out of sight. I opened a notebook and listed what I had paid and where I had slept and what I had said yes to. Numbers tell the truth without raising their voice. I closed the notebook and looked around the cottage. Something inside me changed shape, not with anger, but with clarity. Love without boundaries invites erosion. Peace would require decisions that might look unkind to people who grew used to my yes. I am allowed to protect the life I worked so long to build. This is not a story about regret. It is about carrying love without losing the person who carries it. It is about a mother ready to stand in her own house and name it hers. I woke the next morning with a plan that felt like a spine. Guessing had kept me small. Facts would let me stand up. I called my realtor from the porch while the tide hissed along the rocks, and she answered with the careful, calm people use when they expect to disappoint you. She told me Axel had reached out the week my offer was accepted. He asked about transfer options, about the possibility of making the property work for a larger household, and he spoke as if decisions were already moving. She said she thought I knew, and the apology in her voice sounded like paper thinning under rain. I ended the call and opened the camera app. I scrubbed to late morning and watched Hella's mother try a silver key, then a brass one each, failure tightening her jaw. She stepped back, pulled out her phone, and stared at my door as if patience could melt a lock. A white van rolled to the curb a few minutes later. A man in a tool belt listened, looked at the hinges, and shook his head. He left and she lingered, and the clip ended with an empty porch that felt louder than a shout. In the afternoon, my bank flagged my number. A specialist explained there had been an attempt to access my loan file from an unfamiliar location the previous day. The timestamp lined up with the hour Axel had messaged me about helping with bill pay, and the match clicked into place like a puzzle I did not want to finish. I sat at the kitchen table and opened social media. Hella had posted a photo of a room that looked like my sunroom, made warmer by a filter boxes against the wall, like promises stacked on promises. The caption celebrated the kids finally getting a bigger place and mentioned a room with a big window set aside for her mother. The comments rolled like applause from people who did not know me. Friends asked about the garden and the beach trail and when the first barbecue would be. I took screenshots of each line with its date and time, and my hand steadied as the gallery filled with proof. I drove to the office supply store and bought a thick manila folder, clear sleeves, and a black marker. I printed the camera steals, the bank alert, and a summary of the realtor call, then added the social posts and captions. I wrote evidence on the tab and felt the letter E bite into the cardboard. The dinner invitation arrived by text with promises of a calm conversation and no drama. I accepted because light belongs on the truth, and I wanted it bright. I slid the folder into my tote, breathed with the window cracked, and parked a house away so I could count to 10 before knocking. Their table was set with cloth napkins and a candle that smelled like vanilla and reassurance. Axel pushed glossy listings across the wood like he was presenting a pitch at work, and Hella spoke in a rhythm of features timelines and what would make sense for everyone. The pages showed big yards, extra bedrooms, and cheerful notes about a space perfect for a mother-in-law suite. I listened until the words stacked into a wall I had climbed 100 times. Then I set the folder down in the center so the candlelight caught the plastic sleeves. I told Axel that he had planned my life without me, and that I had brought proof of how far he had gone. He said I hate being alone, and this plan would keep us all close, and I felt the old reflex knock at my ribs, the one that bends before it thinks. I let it knock once, and then I answered with plain air. I told him I did not buy a house to solve your life. I bought it to breathe. Silence took the head of the table. The candle flickered like it was deciding who it belonged to. I gathered the listings and slid them back to his side so the paper would stop pretending it knew me. I reached into my tote and took out a sealed envelope. I placed it in his hand and kept my palm there a heartbeat longer than usual so the weight could register. It was a letter from my attorney instructing them to cease and desist from interfering with my property or my financial accounts. The language inside was dry and spare, but it tasted like clean water after a long road. Boundaries were no longer a polite request. They were written in ink and dated. I stood and thanked them for the meal I had not touched. Hella watched me with a look that mistook calm for cruelty. Axel stared at the envelope like it might turn into a door that opened by itself if he waited long enough. Outside, the air felt honest. I drove home with the windows cracked and the folder buckled on the seat like a quiet passenger. The cottage met me with the soft scrape of the latch and the hush of the sea working its patient job in the dark. I placed the folder on the kitchen table beneath the small lamp. I labeled a second envelope for copies and set it by the door in case the next step needed a duplicate. The house held its breath and then settled back into its own shape, and I understood that proof does more than win an argument. It returns a person to herself. I signed the papers with a steady hand and let the cottage go. Selling it was not defeat. It was a choice to close a battlefield and open space for peace. Colorado Springs welcomed me with air that felt lighter and mornings painted in soft gold. My new house was smaller, but it held me without strain. I planted herbs in a raised bed that spilled thyme over the edge and lifted basil leaves to the sun. Marigolds lined the porch like watchful friends, and I smiled each time I brushed past them. Inside, I kept the walls honest. A gallery of photos showed hikes with colleagues' laughter and wind, and the ribbon cutting of a new branch office where my hand shook the CEOs. They reminded me I had built a life beyond rescue missions. No photos of Axel or Hella hung here. This was not punishment. It was clarity. On the hook by the door hung one single key, smooth and warm from use, with no spare hidden under pots, or slipped into another hand. The sound it made against the wood was the sound of ownership. One evening, the phone rang. Axel's voice was thinner than I remembered, weighed down by debt and pressure from Hala and her mother. He admitted to choices he now called mistakes, and said he did not know how to climb out. I listened without anger because pity and blame had no place in this new house. When he asked if we could start again, I told him respect comes before forgiveness. The line was quiet after that, and I let the silence stand as its own truth. Later, I stepped outside with a pot of golden marigolds cradled in my arms. The sun slipped low, pouring light across my face and the petals until they glowed like fire. I felt steady in the quiet, steady in my right to choose. Peace is not a place. It is knowing you have the right to choose who stands inside your life.